I'm Linda van Tilburg for Biznews, and I have André Pienaar in the Biznews studio with me. He's the founder and CEO of C5 Capital. André, welcome from, is it the Middle East to Biznews?
Thank you, Linda.
Well, you've written an article where you argued that South Africa should rebuild its relationship with Israel. Why do you think that's necessary?
Linda, this is a very important relationship that's more than 75 years old, and it's got many facets and components to it. Um, South Africa has a Jewish community that throughout the country's existence, and particularly in our transition to democracy, have made a really outsized contribution and continue to make an outsized contribution to the country. South Africa was one of the very first states in the world to recognize Israel's independence in 1947. And our relationship with Israel has been multifaceted over the last 75 years, incorporating science, culture, shared values, and of course, trade and investment. Israel is an important export market for South Africa, with approximately about $500 million a year. And that underpins many South African jobs and plays a key role in our access to innovation and technology and the growth of our economy. So this is a really important relationship that's been very well established and that has very deep roots in South Africa. That's precious and valuable for the country, and one that we have to preserve, protect, and build on.
But do you think it's possible? There's just such bad blood at the moment between the Ramaphosa government after that court case, accusing Israel of genocide. Is it possible to rebuild that relationship?
Well, President Ramaphosa's decision to bring charges against Israel in the International Court of Justice in the wake of Hamas's 7th of October attack on the country and its people was just one of the most ill-considered and ill-judged foreign policy steps in South Africa's history. Israel was at peace with Gaza on the morning of the 7th of October, and Hamas launched an attack on the country and its people, which is on par with an attack from another nation state. About 3,400 uniformed Hamas operatives invaded Israel, with about another 2,000 plus terrorists in plain clothes. So all in all, about 6,000 armed operatives attacked the country. That's about the equivalent of 3 to 4 conventional army infantry regiments that invaded Israel. They slaughtered more than 1,200 civilians. They injured more than 5,400 people. And they took approximately 250 Israeli citizens as hostages. Most of the victims here are women, children, and the elderly. So this was a terrible, terrible attack. And at every level, worse than the 9/11 attack, which the US have suffered. If you look at the armaments which the Hamas operatives had, anti-tank weapons, drones, very sophisticated weaponry, this was really on par with an attack by not only by a non-state actor and a terrorist group, but very extensively state-sponsored by Iran. So for South Africa, in the wake of such an attack and of such an atrocity, to bring charges against the victim makes absolutely no sense at all. In South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice, there is no mention of the right to self-defense, which every United Nations member has under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. And if you consider all the facts of this attack, Israel acted in line with its right of self-defense, both in terms of the necessity to defend itself, but also in terms of the proportionality of its response. And so Ramaphosa's allegations and charges against Israel is completely meritless in international law. And secondly, and most important here, it's not in South Africa's national interest. South Africa is not a protagonist in the Middle East. We're a long way away from the Middle East, and there's just no national interest for us to get involved in the conflict and Iran's aggression against Israel.
What do you want the South African government to do? And do you think the present government would do that? And or what would make them change their minds?
Well, I think where we are right now, ordinary people have to do extraordinary things. And so ordinary South Africans have to take the initiative to protect this relationship with Israel, and to preserve it and to build on it. And so I'm launching a private sector initiative to make sure that we continue to build our relationship with Israel and expand it and grow it despite the Ramaphosa government's folly in um, in 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 joining the attack on Israel alongside Iran. Um, if we had a sensible government, they would have withdrawn the case in the International Court of Justice, and they would have made it clear that they want to be part of a peace solution in the Middle East, and they would have steered well away from the terrorist sponsorship of Iran and its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. But I'm afraid that's highly unlikely. President Ramaphosa yesterday published an article in Foreign Policy magazine where he doubled down on his alliance with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and tried to make the case of why he's using South African taxpayers' dollars to pursue this meritorious case, these meritorious claims and allegations in the International Court of Justice against Israel, and why he's allying South Africa with Colombia and a sprinkling of other small states to try and create an international pressure group behind this case. And it's such a waste of taxpayers' money, um, and from a moral point of view, just an absolute folly and a disaster for South Africa and its people.
Well, could you give us more information about this bridge you want to build between, with South African businessmen and Israel? What does the program entail?
Well, in 2004, under the Mbeki government, South Africa signed an investment agreement with Israel, a reciprocal investment agreement. The trade and investment relationship between South Africa and Israel is very well established. In 1931, a group of South African businessmen, even before the State of Israel was established the Africa-Israel Investments Company, specifically to invest in the future of Israel. That became one of the first listed companies on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Since then, we've built a very extensive trade and investment relationship, and Israel is a very important export market for South Africa. We depend on a lot of our technology and know-how in key areas like healthcare and other fields, on Israeli startups and the extraordinary innovation that's happening in Israel. So there's so much to be built on, and that's leaving aside our shared Abrahamic heritage. During President Trump's first term, the Abrahamic Accords were signed between Israel and Bahrain, later joined by the UAE, Morocco, Sudan. And the values that underpins that peace agreement is really something that accords with ordinary South Africans. Across the Christian, the Muslim, and the Judaic faith, we share the same values, which goes back to Abraham, and a very rich heritage of faith and belief and common values. And so beyond our trade and investment relationship, there's a very rich heritage of faith and also of culture that binds our countries together, and then of course of people. There are many Israelis who've lived in South Africa and have contributed to South Africa, and many South Africans who today live in Israel. And so we have people moving between our countries, and people who contribute to the relationship and to the growth of our two countries. And so there's so much here to build on. By way of contrast, South Africa really doesn't have a relationship with Iran. Most ordinary South Africans cannot place Iran on a map. The Shia mullahs who run a theocracy in Iran, a repressive theocracy, are a complete anathema to ordinary South Africans who have an unbridled love of freedom. One of the things we pride ourselves in our country is women's rights. The mullahs in Iran have one of the most repressive regimes for women in the world. Iran is a teeny tiny little export market for South Africa that's very recent, about $10 million. So a fraction of our export market to Israel. So why on earth Ramaphosa has allied our country with this terrible, autocratic, repressive regime that's at the center of global terrorism, beggars belief.
Well, one of the other questions you ask is, that you said was surprising, is that Mr. Ramaphosa, who is a Christian, aligned himself with, somebody like Hamas.
Yes, Islamist terrorism, which is distinct from the Muslim faith, um, is a serious and growing and escalating threat across Africa. These extremist terrorist groups, whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas or Hezbollah, are responsible for the murder of thousands of Christians across Africa on an annual basis. By the last tally, more than 6,000 in 2023. And so why Mr. Ramaphosa was brought up in a Christian home and brought up with the Bible would align himself with these terrible organizations that is repressing Christians and persecuting Christians across Africa, again, just beggars belief.
The other question I have to ask you is, while it's acknowledged the suffering that Israel, have undergone, how do you justify, or how does Israel justify the fact that so many Gazans were killed and, the place basically destroyed in their bombing?
Yeah, so in any war, civilian casualties are a tragedy, and in the war in Gaza, there have been a significant number of civilian casualties. But one must bear in mind that Israel was at peace with Gaza and with Hamas on the morning of October the 7th. The government of Israel was facilitating aid in the region of $1 billion a year for the 2.1 million residents in Gaza. And Israeli officials were taking some of this aid in person into Gaza on a weekly and a monthly basis to make sure it gets properly distributed. And in many ways, Israel did not interfere with Hamas's self-rule and self-government in the Gaza region. On the morning of October the 7th, Hamas launched a very well-prepared, very well-concealed attack on the people of Israel, which was on a scale very similar to that of a conventional invasion of another country. If you consider the number of soldiers who participated, the sophistication of the armory, the territorial scale of the attack, and the target selection. In this attack, they chose to focus on soft targets, and they committed terrible atrocities against ordinary Israeli civilians and killed a very large number of women, of very small children, and of elderly people. In the second phase of this attack, they abducted more than 250 Israeli citizens and residents. This was the largest kidnap and hostage-taking incident that a nation-state has suffered in the 21st century, incomparable in scale. In Israel, of course, it's a very clear memory of what happened at the Munich Olympics in the 1970s, when a terrorist group took about 11 Olympic athletes and their coaches hostage and massacred all of them. So the state of Israel had no choice but to go into Gaza to try and secure the safety of their people, to try and secure the safety of these hostages. And in doing so, launched a very limited attack into a heavy residential area, a very close urban setup. Now, one of the most difficult forms of combat to conduct is in an urban warfare environment. Most conventional forces would try and avoid fighting in an urban warfare environment altogether, because there are so many risks in getting bogged down in urban warfare. And of course, when Israel went into Gaza to retrieve the hostages, they were very well aware of the fact that this was potentially a strategic trap that Hamas set for it, with pre-positioned weapons, pre-positioned points of attack, to launch a massive ambush on Israeli troops as they came into the territory. Despite that, the Israeli Defense Force went out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. And I cannot think of another conventional armed force today in the world that would be able to conduct an operation of this kind with so much discipline, forethought, and consideration to limit civilian casualties. The total civilian casualty toll that's been provided by the Palestinian authorities is in the region of 46,000. Not all of those casualties are attributable to the Israeli Defense Forces. Many of these casualties came about as a result of Hamas's attack on the Israeli Defense Forces, and also came about because Hamas, using Mao Zedong's old dictum, used the civilians in Gaza as human shields and tried to conceal themselves as Mao said, amongst the civilian population as a fish would in the water. And so there were multiple causes for the civilian casualties in Gaza, not all of which can be laid at the feet of the Israeli Defense Force. And given the density of the area and the difficulty of urban warfare, and the scale of this operation, I think the civilian casualties were rather limited. If you were to look at this from a just war point of view, from a just war perspective, it is comparable to the operation which the Allies conducted during the Second World War when they went after the Nazis in Germany. The Allies took the decision to do a strategic bombing campaign of Nazi Germany because they had no choice. It was the only way in which they could overthrow the Nazis and restore peace and protect their own people, and in the end also end the Jewish Holocaust which the Nazis were perpetrating. Unfortunately, in circumstances of war, it's highly likely that there would be civilian casualties. And during the Second World War, we had significant German casualties because of the Allies' strategic warfare, strategic bombing campaign. But I don't think anyone today would argue that that was wrong, and that instead we should have left the Nazis in power, and instead we should have let the Holocaust continue. I think everyone today accepts, although that was a very difficult decision and a terrible toll associated with the war, it was the only morally right thing to do, and justly done in the context of the just war tradition.
André, is there anything you'd like to add?
By contrast, today in South Africa, over the last 24 months, we've had more civilian casualties than the total civilian casualties in Gaza at the hands of organized crime and drug syndicates. In 2023, 30,000 South Africans were murdered by criminals. And in 2024, 35,000. So more than 65,000 ordinary South Africans have been brutally and violently murdered by criminal syndicates and gangs over the course of the last 24 months, far exceeding the civilian casualties that have been suffered during the war in Gaza. This means that on an average day in South Africa, about 100 ordinary innocent South Africans get murdered by criminals. And at least a third of these victims are women and children. President Ramaphosa has now been in power for 4 terms, 2 terms as a deputy president, 1 term as a president. In total, during the course of his 4 terms in office, he has led a government that has seen more than 500,000 ordinary South Africans being murdered by criminal groups and by syndicates. And the question is, why does President Ramaphosa not focus on this near and present danger to his own people, instead of going to file charges against Israel in its hour of crisis and need in the International Court of Justice? Last year, more than 17,000, to be precise, 17,676 South Africans were kidnapped and taken as hostages. So a multiple of the 250 Israeli citizens that were kidnapped by Hamas. The prosecution rate for those kidnappings is 0. Today, most of those South Africans are still being held hostage by criminal groups across our country. There's no public debate about this. The government has made no statement about this. President Ramaphosa has allowed drug cartels to make kidnap for ransom in South Africa a multi-billion-dollar business on his watch. He's done nothing about it. The question is, why would we go and spend South African taxpayer monies to pursue a long-standing trade and investment partner, an ally like Israel in the International Court of Justice, if ordinary South Africans have to suffer this tragedy, this terrible, terrible tragedy, daily at home? The prosecution rate for murder cases in South Africa is less than 1 out of 10. Why doesn't President Ramaphosa spend the government's money to address this near and present danger? Is it negligence? Is it cowardice? Or is it complicity with these criminal groups? All these South Africans need to know, and all these South Africans demand to know. If we were to take the souls of all the murdered South Africans and convene them in the FNB Stadium, there would not be enough space for all of them. If we were to convene the loved ones of those who've been murdered during President Ramaphosa's watch and government, there would be more than 10 million people gathered outside the FNB Stadium for this terrible wake. It is the souls of the murdered and their loved ones who are crying out for justice and demanding justice. And justice should first start at home. The government's got to address this near and present danger to its own people in the first instance. And that's where the country's national interest lies. In the absence of the government doing anything about this, I'm launching a museum, a digital museum in the memory of murdered South Africans. I'm giving ordinary South Africans an opportunity to tell the story about their loved ones, their neighbors, their family members, their children, the members of their community, their colleagues who've been murdered at the hands of criminals or who've been kidnapped, so that we can recognize each South African as a precious human life and as a precious human being, and that we can tell the story of this atrocity that's happening on a daily basis in South Africa. I'm not talking about farm murders. Farm murders are definitely part of the story, and our isolated rural communities are at risk of organized crime. I'm talking about murders and violence, kidnappings that are taking place inside Black communities, inside urban communities. And I'm talking about an atrocity and a threat that's completely colorblind in our country, but that continues unabated on a daily basis. And that is far worse than a conventional war or a civil war. And that our government need to address as a matter of great urgency. And that's where the question of impunity lies. Under South African laws and under the Constitution, the president has a responsibility, a legal responsibility, to prevent crime from happening to ordinary South Africans. The South African Constitution guarantees the right to life for all its citizens. It guarantees that no South African have to suffer violence or any form of torture. Under the Policing and Prevention of Organized Crime Act, it places an obligation on the police to protect South African citizens from crime. The fact that we have more than 100 South Africans being murdered on a daily basis, the fact that we have thousands of South Africans being kidnapped annually, the fact that we have an almost minuscule prosecution rate of these criminals are very serious breaches of South African law, very serious violations of our Constitution on the part of President Ramaphosa and the ANC's ministers who have prevailed and presided over this tragedy. And this is the injustice that South Africans demand should be addressed as a matter of urgency. Not things that thousands of miles away from us. It's what's happening at home on a daily basis. That's where the cry for justice is coming from. That's where the legal liability and legal responsibility lies. And that is what South Africans now demand this government address.
André, just quickly as a last question, what form would this museum take?
It will be to begin with, a digital museum where any South African can post and tell the story of anybody that they know that have been a victim of serious and violent South African crime, whether it's murder or kidnapping. It will involve posting a photograph of the victim and telling their story as a precious human being, not the story of their crime, but their story as a precious human being. And I think this is a very important first step for us to start an open debate about what is happening in the country, to start an open debate about what is happening with crime. And I think it's an opportunity for everyone in South Africa to come together to honor the victims of violent crime and to recognize the value of these human lives and to begin to document what happened to them and the suffering that they've had as a first step towards making a claim against President Ramaphosa and his ministers for redress for this grave and serious violation of the Constitution and South Africa's laws, which is not only morally reprehensible, but also for which they carry a very serious legal liability.
André Pienaar, the founder and CEO of C5 Capital, thanks so much for speaking to us.
And thank you so much.